Chapter 2 relates to Deacon Gregory Stone's son, known in history as Elder John Stone. The legacy left by Deacon Gregory Stone cast a long and upright shadow over the fledgling colony of Massachusetts. Having rooted the family in Cambridge with a name built on integrity, piety, and civic duty, he and his brother Simon established the Stones as men to be trusted, leaders both in church and community. This strong foundation did not die with the first generation. It opened doors for Gregory's sons to carry on the family's reputation in the New World. Chief among them was Elder John Stone, a man shaped by his father's firm example, but destined to leave his own imprint upon the colony. As the second generation of Stones stepped forward, the values of dependability and leadership did not merely endure, they deepened. Elder John Stone, son of Deacon Gregory, was born in Nayland in Suffolk County, England. He was baptized on July 31, 1618, and when he was 17 years old, he accompanied his father on the ocean voyage to New England in 1635. There, in Watertown and Cambridge, Massachusetts, he spent his minority years. Upon reaching manhood in 1639, he was given a portion of his patrimony from his father and established himself in the new town of Sudbury, Massachusetts. He would also marry Anne Howe, a sister of Nathaniel Treadway and granddaughter of Edward Howe. She would bear him 10 children and survive him. The site of their home has been located, but only fragments of stone remain. His home was located on 9 acres in the town of Willard, formerly East Sudbury. His neighbors were Henry Curtis on the east and Nathaniel Treadway on the west. On February 22, 1639, he was given 3 grants of meadow land, comprising 2.5 acres and 4.5 acres on April 20, 1640, and 9 acres on November 18, 1640. He also shared in the ownership of some uplands and property on the commons. For whatever reason, in 1646, he sold all his property to John Moore and moved the following year up the Sudbury River to a primeval forest of virgin timber. On February 22, 1639, he was given 3 grants of meadow land, comprising 2.5 acres and 4.5 acres on April 20, 1640, and 9 acres on November 18, 1640. He also shared in the ownership of some uplands and property on the commons. For whatever reason, in 1646, he sold all his property to John Moore and moved the following year up the Sudbury River to a primeval forest of virgin timber. In the bitter chill of December 1661, John Stone stood on the ridge above the Corlett farm, the snow crunching beneath his boots, as he surveyed the 200 acres he'd just claimed, not for conquest, but for legacy. A man of few words but quiet foresight, he saw more than trees and fields, he saw futures. By 1658, he'd already laid the foundation for it all, raising a sturdy timber home near what would, centuries later, become the Saxonville railway station. There, one by one, he built homes for his sons, planting the family like oaks in the soil of Sudbury. That same year, with sweat and precision, he dammed the river and constructed the grist mill at Sudbury Falls, a structure that would grind grain, bear witness to storms, and carry his name for generations. When Edward Howe died in 1666, John, along with his sharp-minded brother-in-law Nathaniel Treadway, took up the heavy mantle of executor. The ensuing land disputes shifted the boundaries of entire townships. From the ashes of Howe's debts and Thomas Mayhew's reluctant concessions, John acquired another 1,000 acres, the stretch of wilderness that would one day be known as Zionville. Yet for all his acquisitions, John Stone remained a figure on the edges of the town's political stage. He had no hunger for titles or town meetings. His legacy, he believed, would be carved not in votes or laws, but in timber, stone, and the turning wheel of a mill. When word reached Sudbury in the early spring of 1672 that his father, Deacon Gregory had died, elder John Stone packed his affairs with the same quiet resolve that had built his life. The land in Zionville, the homes for his sons, and the ever-turning wheel of the mill, all of it would now stand without him. Cambridge called him back, not with joy, but with duty. There, in the creaking silence of his boyhood home, he inherited the estate in full, land, books, debts, and memories buried deeper than any cornerstone. For a decade more, he lived in the old house, tending to affairs with a kind of reverent detachment, a man whose roots had spread so wide they no longer knew where they began. But by the grace of quiet foresight, or perhaps Providence, John had already returned to Cambridge by the time the first flames of King Philip's War lit up the forests of New England in 1675. But who was this King Philip, who brought this flood of bloodshed so suddenly upon the peaceful settlers of Massachusetts? First of all, the now infamous name of King Philip was given to Chief Metacom of the Wampanoag tribe by his brother Wamsuta, according to his people's tradition of taking English names. And the war was not sudden, but had been a long simmering hatred brought on by the greed and arrogance of the English Puritan leaders, who first landed on America's shores in 1628. And although it had begun as scattered violence, it soon turned into a wildfire of blood and ash that swept through every fragile boundary the settlers had drawn. And the root of it was no mystery to those who dared to see white men carving their farms into ancient tribal lands. The English, in their proffered superiority, demanded that the native peoples not only yield their territory, but also their identities. They must farm like Englishmen, pray like Englishmen, and kneel before English laws. But the tribes had bowed for too long. Wampanoag, Narragansett, Nipmuc, all rose together in one final, desperate brotherhood under the leadership of Metacom. It was a war not just for land, but for memory, for dignity, for the right to exist as they were. And John's old homestead in Sudbury would not likely escape the fury, as his home and mill stood in the shadow of fear, as raids crept ever closer. Friends and neighbors, men he'd shared the harvest with, took up muskets and waited in the dark. Homes burned. Roads disappeared into the wilderness once more. But John, now in Cambridge, watched the war from a distance, a silent witness to the unraveling. Though the mill still turned, and the land still bore fruit, something had shifted in the soul of the colony, something that no amount of victory could mend. That something was King Philip's War, which left more than charred homes and blood-soaked fields in its wake. It stirred something deeper, something that would not settle easily back into silence. For the first time, the colonists found themselves alone. The Crown, distant and disinterested, offered no soldiers, no silver, and no solace. In the forests of New England, they fought and bled without their king's care or support. And in that crucible, something unexpected took shape. Not just anger or sorrow, but identity. They were no longer just Englishmen in exile. They were something else now, hardened by loss, shaped by necessity, and bound together not by loyalty to a monarch, but by their shared survival upon unforgiving soil. Among the ashes of King Philip's War, a new mindset began to emerge, independent, skeptical, self-reliant. John had once seen his future in acres and water wheels, but now watched from Cambridge as the world changed. He had always been a man of the land, not of politics, but even he could feel it. A shift in the wind. A quiet, growing question in the hearts of men like his sons: what do we owe to a king who does not come? And so, even when peace returned, it was not going to be the same peace. It was peace with a seed of discontent buried deep beneath it, one that would take 100 years to bloom, but when it did, it would change the world. So, even as John turned his gaze inward in Cambridge, the wider family name, Stone, was called outward, to arms, to war. The flames of King Philip's War did not discriminate between town and farm, old blood and new. Many of Gregory Stone's descendants were summoned to defend what their fathers had built, called not by king or general, but by necessity, by survival. Among them was Samuel Stone Jr., who was John's nephew and the son of Deacon Samuel and Sarah Stone. Born in 1656, he had grown to manhood in Cambridge, among the furrows and fences his father helped to raise. Samuel Jr. had married Dorcas Jones and settled in the outlying fields of Cambridge Farms, the place that would one day be called Lexington. The land had once been Gregory Stone's, granted by the town for his faithful service, and when the elder Stone passed, a portion was turned over to Samuel, just east of where his brother David now tilled the soil. Among them was Samuel Stone Jr., who was John's nephew and the son of Deacon Samuel and Sarah Stone. Born in 1656, he had grown to manhood in Cambridge, among the furrows and fences his father helped to raise. Samuel Jr. had married Dorcas Jones and settled in the outlying fields of Cambridge Farms, the place that would one day be called Lexington. The land had once been Gregory Stone's, granted by the town for his faithful service, and when the elder Stone passed, a portion was turned over to Samuel, just east of where his brother David now tilled the soil. And though the war would one day end, and though Samuel would live to see peace again, something would have changed. They were no longer just settlers. They were survivors. And that identity, forged in blood and fire, would shape what Lexington would soon become. So, how did King Philip's War begin, and who were its players in this sardonic little play of empire and pride? It was not with musket fire or village raids, but with demands, delays, and a tribute unpaid. It was October of 1654, when the first true tremor rippled across the New England frontier. The Niantic, long simmering under pressure, had grown restless. And so, the call came, summoning the militia. Among the men ordered to ride was Samuel Stone, not yet 25, saddling his horse alongside 60 others under the weathered eye of Major Simon Willard shown here. This play, this war, this endless grasping for power, was following this age-old plot. It needed no rehearsals. The script had been passed down, written not on paper, but in blood and soil. An enemy. A refusal. A silence. A slight. That was all it took. The names changed, but the plot remained. First, the colonists claimed friendship. Then came the treaties, crafted in ink but interpreted in hunger. When resistance rose, however small or justified, the refrain returned: an enemy. A refusal. A silence. A slight. And with it, the cannons. The muskets. The march of men like Samuel Stone, bound not by hatred, but by orders that must be followed for God and King. And somewhere in the quiet spaces between each new war, soldiers would continue to wonder why they had to ride under their leaders' flags for debts they didn't owe, and fight enemies they'd never known, all for the sake of failed diplomacy they couldn't control. Their commanders would speak of duty and discipline, but their souls knew that it would come again. It always did. And it came again when Ninigret, the sachem of the Niantic, was summoned by the colonists to appear in Hartford, Connecticut, and deliver the tribute they claimed he owed, part of a treaty made in peace, but honored by only one side. The land-hungry colonists, allies now of the Long Island tribes, believed they could dictate terms at their convenience. Ninigret believed otherwise. He refused to appear at their beck and call. And in response, the Massachusetts Bay Colony did what it always did when diplomacy failed: it declared war. That declaration was answered by 270 soldiers, who were dispatched, marching under banners painted with symbols of righteousness. Among them rode Samuel Stone, with 40 mounted men, across a land his grandfather had once known as unbroken forest. The irony was as sharp as any blade. A war declared for a debt in a language not his own, for a law only the English obeyed, but no one ever spoke of that. To the colonists, they were asserting order. To the Niantic, it was a vision of the future for all Native Americans. And so began not just a skirmish, but the opening act of a war that would smolder for another 20 years before it would finally explode in fire and blood. But Willard's mission was simple in its command, yet impossibly complex in its execution. He was ordered to locate Ninigret, extract the long-overdue tribute, and force an end to the rising tension with the Long Island tribes. Samuel Stone, musket strapped to his back, rode not toward battle, but toward a confrontation built on an assumption, an English demand made in a native world that had grown tired of listening. But Ninigret would not stand and meet them. At the first scent of the colonial troops, he vanished into the swampland, silent, proud, untouched. Willard, bound by restraint or doubt, chose not to pursue. And so, after 16 uneventful days, Samuel and his fellow riders turned back toward Cambridge with no victory, no glory, just silence. Yet that silence spoke volumes. What had been avoided had not been resolved, only delayed. Beneath the outward calm, the tension remained, growing like rot beneath a floorboard. And so, the question lingered, was this a mission accomplished? Or was it merely the opening move of a darker symphony? In time, the answer would come. For what followed 20 years later in 1675, when blood truly soaked the soil and New England burned from Deerfield to Providence, was not a new war, but one finally resumed. The same grievances. The same ignorance. The same refusal to understand a people before trying to subdue them. It was no coincidence. It was a pattern. It was a prelude. And that same prelude would also engulf David Stone, son of Elder John and Stone, and the grandson of the Venerable Gregory. He was born into the town of Sudbury on October 21, 1646, at a time when the wilderness still pressed close around every hearth. He was not a passenger of the voyage, as his father had been, but a child raised among trees that knew no master and rivers that had never been dammed. When the family left Cambridge and struck deeper into the unsettled woods, it was not ambition that led them, it was the lure of quiet, of space. Their homestead would rise on what would one day be known as Framingham, Massachusetts, though in those early days it was no more than a clearing and a prayer. When David reached manhood, his father gave him a gift that was both legacy and burden, 20 acres south of the Sudbury River Falls. The land was rich, dark, and unspoiled, a piece of promise carved from forest and the envy of every farmer. But a promise, in that age, was never without peril. In 1675, the drums of war were removed from hibernation, as their beating grew louder across the fields. David, like his cousin Samuel, was called to defend the very earth he had just begun to call his own. It was no longer enough to build. Now, he would be asked to protect. To bleed. And perhaps, he feared, that what his father had begun, he would see burned and destroyed. That same year David would marry Susanna, who would watch her husband answer the call to arms by joining his newly formed cavalry unit under the command of the renowned Captain Thomas Prentice of Cambridge. This unit represented the newest addition to the colonial militia, soon recognized as the third branch of military service. These mounted soldiers, now called troopers, were increasingly viewed by military leaders as a vital and perhaps superior force within the colonial defense structure. This new military philosophy had long been a matter of concern in the colony, with ongoing efforts to increase the number of horses and strengthen cavalry forces. As early as 1648, the same year Captain Thomas Prentice arrived, laws were passed to encourage the formation of mounted militia units. Troopers were expected to provide their own horses, but were compensated with 5 shillings per year, and exempted from both the head tax, a fixed levy on individuals, and the livestock tax on their horses. These incentives naturally attracted the more prosperous colonists, and positions of command were typically given to men of notable skill and social standing. By the beginning of King Philip's War in 1675, 5 regular cavalry companies, or troops, had been organized in the colony. Captain Thomas Prentice was given command of the Middlesex Troop, which initially drew its mounted soldiers from towns near Boston. Upon his arrival in the colonies in 1648, Thomas quickly became embedded in the county's militia forces. He carried himself with the bearing of a natural soldier, confident in both speech and stride. It is said that he learned the art of warfare under none other than Colonel Robert Harlakenden while serving in Cromwell's army. Their bond must have been strong, for when the colonel died of smallpox in 1638, he left £30 to his former student. Under his leadership, the use of this new cavalry weapon began to take shape. In Europe, a corps of thundering cavalry was a sight to behold as it smashed into the opposing forces. However, the terrain of New England was not Europe. So, for the time being, Prentice's mounted soldiers were used for scouting, reconnaissance, and chasing fleeing enemies. The battle-hardened veteran also encouraged the use of the flintlock musket over that of the matchlock. The new rifles fired a .69 to .80 caliber bullet with a range of 500 yards with much greater accuracy. However, the Indians also carried the same weapon for many of their warriors. The main significant difference was the warriors had only limited supply chains for their powder and ball that grew worse as the days of war went by. As Prentice rose to the rank captain in 1662, his future opponent, Metacom, had become the chief of the Wampanoag tribe that same year. Was this an omen of what was to be? Now, with the reins of power now firmly in his hands, Metacom's old bitterness surfaced from the past grievances inflicted on his people. Years of deceit, land theft, and cultural erosion at the hands of the English settlers had pushed he and his people to the brink. As settlers continued to expand across tribal lands with impunity, Metacom could no longer endure the slow destruction of his people. Determined to resist, he sought to forge a powerful alliance, bringing together neighboring tribes such as the Nipmuc, Pocumtuck, and Narragansett into a confederacy with one singular goal: to reclaim their homeland and drive the colonists back into the sea. However, Metacom's plans were secretly overheard and reported to the English by John Sassamorne, an Indian interpreter who had lived among the colonists. When confronted, Metacom vehemently denied the allegations. Yet, the rumors appeared true when, on January 29, 1675, Sassamorne was found dead under mysterious circumstances. Too mysterious. His body was found underneath the ice in a nearby lake with a broken neck. 2 months later, after fruitless interrogations and scant evidence, Governor Josiah Winslow presented 3 Wampanoag men, 2 warriors, and a young boy, as the alleged killers of Sassamorne. Testimony from several praying Indians claimed to have witnessed the murder, but the validity of their accounts remained questionable. Nonetheless, the colonial court moved swiftly. On June 8, 1675, all 3 Wampanoag were hanged, a decision that many saw as a breach of the 1621 treaty, which guaranteed native sovereignty in such legal matters. For Metacom, this act was the final provocation. The execution became his rallying cry, the justification he needed to unite the tribes and ignite a full-scale war against the English. When the possibilities were considered by the powers to be, thought it best to let things lie, with no military demonstration. If need be, they could send troops to intimidate the tribes to get back in line. 3 days after the executions, the Wampanoag struck back. On June 24, 1675, they launched a surprise demonstration of their own at Swansea, Massachusetts. Upon repeated provocation, to include shooting a settler's cattle, shots were fired and a warrior went down. That was all they needed to retaliate. Several colonists were killed and others wounded as homes were set ablaze. 2 men went for a doctor and both were slain and their mutilated bodies left in the road. The attack sent shockwaves through the colony. As word spread, the English scrambled to fortify their frontier towns and dispatch aid to vulnerable outposts. Panic gripped the settlements, and defenses were hastily prepared. The long-simmering tension had finally erupted into open conflict. King Philip's War had begun. Scattered settlements across New England soon felt the fury of the war. At Salmon Falls, Massachusetts, a brutal attack unfolded. As the raiders descended, 15 women and children took shelter in a cabin, hoping to escape the violence. Inside, a young woman stood her ground, fiercely defending the doorway, as the others fled to safety. Despite her bravery, the attackers hacked through the door with tomahawks, eventually overwhelming her and leaving her for dead. Nearby, 2 children, aged 7 and 3, were captured. Tragically, the youngest could not keep pace and was killed. Remarkably, the heroic young woman survived her ordeal. She would recover from her injuries and live to see the end of the war, a symbol of courage of a pioneer woman amid the chaos of a brutal conflict. As the English mobilized in response to Metacom's uprising, 2 prominent leaders emerged in the colonial defense: Captain Thomas Prentice and Benjamin Church. Like Prentice, Church was familiar with Native American warfare, an advantage his fellow colonists lacked. While the native forces moved swiftly and skillfully through the forests, often leaving the English confused and disoriented, Church consistently managed to track them. He distinguished himself not only by his fearless conduct in battle, but also by his ability to communicate with native peoples, even persuading many to support the English cause. Thus, 3 companies were dispatched to Swansea: an infantry unit under Captain Daniel Henchman, a cavalry troop led by Captain Prentice, and a third composed of so-called volunteers. This last group was a motley assembly of adventurers, sailors, and even condemned pirates who had been spared execution in exchange for military service. Despite their dubious origins, all 3 companies marched out of Boston on June 26 and arrived at the devastated village 2 days later. Upon arrival, the native warriors had withdrawn into the dense forests and swamps beyond the bridge, lacking the organization to confront such a formidable force head-on. On June 29, Major Thomas Savage arrived with yet another company of infantry, surely enough firepower, it was thought, to deter any foolhardy assault. The following day, shots were fired from the bushes across the river. 12 troopers volunteered to run them off. Troopers Joseph Belcher and Corporal John Gill led the detachment along with a guide, William Hammond. No sooner had they charged across the bridge, the warriors opened up, wounding Belcher in the knee and killing his horse. Gill was shot in the chest, but his thick jacket saved him from serious injury. Sadly, Hammond was killed immediately. The next day, Prentice's cavalry charged across the bridge, driving back the enemy and killing 5 warriors. In that charge was 2 of the Stone cousins, Samuel Stone Jr. and David Stone, both connected to the family's patriarch, Deacon Gregory. Meanwhile, Benjamin Church Wright scouted the surrounding woods and discovered a substantial force of hostiles lying in wait. A fierce battle erupted, resulting in heavy casualties amongst the warriors before they once again slipped away into the safety of the Pocasset Swamp. It was here that Church's leadership during the engagement stood out. His resolve and effectiveness in the heat of battle foreshadowed the vital role he would go on to play in the war. On June 30th, Prentice and his men spent the day scouting the Mount Hope area before riding to Rehoboth, 9 miles hence, where they quartered for the night. The next morning, Samuel and David saddled up to continue their patrol. However, they soon came upon a group of warriors setting a settler's house ablaze and gave chase. The surrounding fences hindered their horses, allowing the attackers to escape. Meanwhile, Lieutenant Edward Oakes of Cambridge, leading a separate detachment, managed to circle the warriors and intercept them in an open field. In the ensuing skirmish, 2 of Metacom's sub-chiefs were killed. Sadly, Prentice's unit lost Trooper John Drews in the fight. Believing that Metacom was trapped in the swamps, Massachusetts authorities recalled their troops to Boston. But alas, Metacom had already escaped. Prentice and his men, meanwhile, were ordered to continue scouting westward toward the village of Mendon, where several farmers had recently been killed by Indian raiders. Exhausted but exhilarated, the 2 Stone cousins eventually returned home, proud of their contribution to the war effort thus far. On July 16, word reached the English that the Quahawks were gathering on an island beyond Brookfield. Hoping for a peaceful resolution, they arranged a meeting with the tribe for the following day at a site 3 miles from town. But when they arrived, the Quahawks were nowhere to be found. Still determined to establish peace, the English rode to the spot where they had first met the day before, unaware that it was a carefully laid trap. As they entered the area, they were ambushed and surrounded. 8 soldiers were killed instantly, and 5 others were wounded, one of them mortally. The survivors retreated to Brookfield and took shelter in a fortified house. The Quahawk warriors pursued and laid siege to the building, surrounding the trapped men for several harrowing days until reinforcements finally arrived and lifted the siege. On August 27, 1675, as tensions continued to rise, Prentice and his men, accompanied by Samuel and David Stone, were recalled and dispatched on a raid against Mount Hope, the heart of Metacom's territory. The objective was clear: to destroy his village, long regarded as both the stronghold of his tribe and a symbol of his influence. It was hoped that such a blow would undermine his authority among the allied tribes. The raid succeeded in driving Metacom from the region, forcing him to relocate. Yet rather than quelling the threat, the assault only deepened the conflict. Far from weakening resistance, it inflamed it, galvanizing Metacom's allies and escalating the war to new heights. On September 1, native warriors launched a surprise attack on the village of Difffield, setting most of the homes ablaze and killing one of the soldiers stationed there before moving on. The following day, they descended upon Northfield. At the time, most of the farmers were out in the fields harvesting their crops, while their wives and children remained in their homes, some distance away. Without warning, warriors struck from all directions. The farmers were cut down where they stood, and their families were slaughtered in the village. Homes were set alight, and the livestock was driven off, leaving the once thriving settlement in smoldering ruins. On September 3, a relief force of 30 mounted men accompanied by an ox team was dispatched to rescue the garrison at Northfield. But before they could reach their destination, they were ambushed, 20 of them killed in the onslaught. In the wake of these devastating losses, colonial commanders abandoned offensive operations and shifted to a defensive strategy. Yet despite the change in tactics, the violence only escalated, and the bloodshed showed no signs of abating. Then, on September 18, a company of soldiers above was assigned to escort a convoy assigned to transporting wagonloads of grain from Difffield to Hadley. Metacom observed the company stop their wagons, and the men disembarked and began gathering grain to fill the wagons. Metacom had his warriors cut down trees ahead of them to block the road. When the group reached the felled trees, they began to move them from the path, but sadly left their weapons in the wagons to move the logs from the path. Those not engaged with clearing the road went foraging for food. But once again, disaster struck as 500 warriors launched a sudden, brutal attack, wiping out 74 soldiers and civilians. Nearby, a detachment stationed at Duffield heard the gunfire and rushed to the scene. Driven by fury, they launched a counterattack and managed to drive the warriors back into the surrounding woods and swamps. The defeat at Bloody Brook, and the relentless violence carried out by the native Confederacy cast a deep and somber pall over the colonies. The High Command was at a loss. With small, scattered settlements stretched across the frontier, they struggled to devise an effective defense, or to stem the tide of bloodshed that now seemed unstoppable. Then came October 19, 1675, when Metacom moved his warriors into position to strike the village of Hatfield in western Massachusetts, located in Hampshire County. Everything was going according to plan until Captain Samuel Moseley dispatched a patrol at noon, consisting of 10 soldiers, to scout the area following reports of nearby enemy activity. The native warriors had apparently built large fires north of Hatfield and then lay in ambush along the road leading to that area. Upon learning of the approaching patrol, Metacom sent a group of warriors to intercept them before they could discover the ambush site. The patrol was composed of 7 of Moseley's scouts and 3 men from Hatfield. One of Moseley's scouts was Richard Stone, a cousin of the other Stone men fighting elsewhere that day. The patrol set out from Hatfield and rode toward Hadley, a nearby village separated only by the Connecticut River. Unaware that an ambush had been laid, they proceeded down the road. Suddenly, muskets cracked from the tree line, and 7 soldiers at the front fell from their horses. Warriors emerged from behind and attacked the 3 men in the rear, dragging some from their mounts. The fight was over in moments. 9 young men, including Richard Stone, lay dead in the roadway above. Only 1 soldier escaped, racing back toward Hatfield to raise the alarm. With the element of surprise lost, Metacom ordered a full-scale attack on the town. However, Major Samuel Appleton was well prepared. With great courage, he defended one end of Hatfield, while Captain Samuel Moseley held the center and Captain Jonathan Poole commanded the opposite flank. Metacom's carefully laid plans for a massacre unraveled. The warriors who charged forward were met with fierce resistance and were cut down, forcing Metacom to retreat. The aura of the invincible warriors was finally shattered. They could be beaten at their own game, and now was the time to do it. With winter approaching, Metacom's warriors needed to prepare their families for the harsh months ahead. Vegetables, fruits, and grain had to be gathered and preserved. Brine needed to be mixed to cure meats, and their huts insulated with extra bark to retain heat from the constant fires. But none of this could be done while on the warpath. As the tribes turned to these vital preparations, the English prepared as well, but for a different reason. Too many settlers and their children now lay in their graves. The time had come to strike a decisive blow and retake the offensive. The English knew the native forces would be at their most vulnerable in the coming months. Therefore, the English forces and their native allies began to gather under the leadership of Governor Josiah Winslow Wright for a decisive blow to Metacom and his Confederate tribes. Their plan was to secure all outlying towns with sufficient garrisons to protect them. With that accomplished, he began building his army from whatever sources were available, but his goal was 1,000 soldiers. To reach such a lofty number, he set quotas for the colonies of Massachusetts 527, Plymouth 158, and Connecticut 325. For whatever reason, Rhode Island was not included. Winslow would assume the position of commander-in-chief, with Major Samuel Appleton in command of the Massachusetts force. They then divided the Massachusetts group into 6 companies of infantry, and 1 of cavalry under Captain Thomas Prentice with Samuel in the vanguard. Plymouth and Connecticut were divided the same. The Massachusetts soldiers collected on December 9 and marched to Dedham, Massachusetts, which was a crucial supply center for the English during the war. It also had a strategic advantage for protection, such as the Charles River to the north and the swamps covering the south and east approaches. Marching along with the infantry was Prentice and his cavalry troop heading for Wickford and then on to Pettaquamscut. There, he brought back the news of the destruction of Bull's Garrison House, just south of Wickford, Rhode Island. It was the home of Jira Bull, about 7 miles east of the Narragansett's fort in the Great Swamp. Word had spread that the house was to be used as a gathering site for the colonial troops heading for the fort. Ahead of the troops, Metacom's warriors burned the house on December 15. No matter, it did not and could not slow the vengeful force heading their way. In the middle of this army was the battle-hardened Captain Prentice, leading his stalwart band of troopers anywhere and everywhere, each one eager for what many believed would be a final, decisive engagement of the war. The looming conflict would later come to be known as the Narragansett Expedition, or, more grimly, the Great Swamp Fight. And riding right behind Prentice was the Stone cousins, who was more than ready to follow this man to hell and back. Both Gregory and elder John had likely crossed paths with this renowned warrior during their years in Cambridge, where Prentice's formidable presence was well known. He was deeply feared by his enemies, a reputation he had learned to wield to his advantage more than once in the field. Ironically, his end came not amid the fury of battle, but years later, on July 7, 1710, when he fell from his horse while returning from church. A quiet, almost tragic conclusion to the life of a man who had once ridden at the heart of New England's most brutal war. In the meantime, Governor Josiah Winslow finalized his plans with his command staff as they headed toward the settlement near what is now Kingston, Rhode Island. However, to reach the battlefield, Winslow's forces had to march through the sovereign territory of the Rhode Island colony. But Winslow, on a mission of annihilation, was undeterred by any diplomatic concerns. To bolster the English ranks, Winslow's army included their allied Pequot and Mohegan warriors. These warriors had their own axe to grind with these tribes, and this was as good a place as any to settle the score. While the primary instigators of the conflict had been Metacom and his Wampanoag, the Narragansett, led by the sachem Canonchet, had attempted to remain neutral in the growing storm. However, their neutrality came into question when they refused Winslow's demand to surrender any Wampanoag refugees who had taken shelter among them. The refusal of the Narragansett to surrender the Wampanoag refugees led to the belief that Canonchet was harboring King Philip himself. As a result, the colonists officially declared his tribe an enemy and would be treated as such. Then nature itself intervened. As winter took hold, the temperature plunged, and the weather turned bitterly cold. The pace of the war slowed as both the English and native forces suffered alike. But fighting in the bitter cold of December would not be an easy task, if they could even find the warriors amid the vast, snow-covered wilderness. But they still had to find the enemy's stronghold in the midst of the vicious storm. Then another stroke of fortune came their way when one of King Philip's own warriors deserted his cause and offered crucial information about the location of the Wampanoag camp. The deserter guided Winslow's army through a fierce snowstorm, leading them directly to the winter stronghold of the Wampanoag. Despite these challenges, and perhaps overly eager to engage, David Stone and his fellow soldiers were ordered to attack prematurely on December 19, 1675. With only 2 companies of men, they moved forward without waiting for the rest of the army to arrive. This hasty decision proved disastrous. The Narragansett mounted a fierce defense, and the English soldiers were repelled with heavy losses. Among the wounded was Samuel Stone, badly injured in the initial bloody skirmish. Another casualty was the brave Captain Isaac Johnson, who was among the first to fall while gallantly leading his men across the fatal tree bridge into the entrance to the fort. Within moments another, Captain Nathaniel Davenport fell dead as well. As the outcome of the fight was looking bleak, Captain Benjamin Church stepped forward, taking command of the situation and leading a more coordinated attack across the frozen swamp. Through sheer determination, Church and his men broke through the log palisade and poured into the encampment. The warriors put up a fierce resistance, but it was ultimately in vain, as they were overwhelmed by the colonists' numbers and resolve. In the chaos, the colonists set the stockade ablaze, likely to create confusion among the defending warriors, who were now torn between fighting the invaders and protecting their families. The fight would go down in history as the most brutal and lopsided military encounter in all of New England history. Those who did not fall in battle were consumed by the flames, many of them women, children, and the elderly. The casualty toll was staggering. 70 colonists were killed, and 150 were wounded. For the Narragansett, the losses were catastrophic. 650 warriors and non-combatants were killed, 1,300 non-combatants were wounded, and 300 were captured. The few who managed to escape into the swamp perished shortly afterward from exposure to the bitter cold, sealing the fate of the tribe. Afterwards, many of the survivors were sold into slavery and transported to Bermuda, Barbados, Jamaica, Spain, Portugal, Madeira, and the Azores. Many were scattered throughout the colonies as indentured servants. After the battle, Captain Prentice did not rest. The smoke of war still clung to the cold December air, as he led a series of relentless scouting raids into the surrounding wilderness, all without Samuel, who was recuperating from his wounds. On the 27th, he and his men rode into Pomham's country, what is now Warwick, Rhode Island, a region once thick with life and warmth. They found it quiet, the land sleeping under a crust of frost. There, they set fire to a large number of wigwams, the flames devouring bark and thatch, crackling through the silence. Smoke spiraled into the sky, heavy with the scent of scorched pine and something darker. By the time they rode out, the village lay in ruin, its people scattered, its stores of food turned to ash, its future buried beneath the snow. Weeks passed, and still the fighting did not end. On January 21, Prentice launched another raid, this one bloodier than the last. When the smoke cleared, 9 lay dead in the snow, and 2 prisoners, ghostly with fear, were bound and taken away. The winter campaign had been long and bitter, and though the men had fought bravely, their bodies ached with cold and exhaustion. Their boots were split from frost, their hands raw and cracked. Even the horses stumbled with weariness. By January 27, the time had come to return home. The campaign was over, for now. The army turned northward, its pace slow, the men hollow-eyed but alive. Snow fell lightly as they marched, cloaking the land in silence. When they finally reached Boston, the Massachusetts men were dismissed. They had earned their rest. Samuel walked with a limp, his coat stained and torn, his face older than it had been just weeks before. He bore the marks of battle not only in flesh, but in spirit, silent, withdrawn, as though some part of him had been left behind in the smoke and snow. David, by contrast, could not stop talking. In taverns and by the hearths of friends, he regaled anyone who would listen with tales of their great fight. His eyes lit with the memory, his voice rising with every account, the charge through the swamp, the crack of musket fire, the fierce cries of the enemy. He told it all in vivid detail, his hands dancing through the air like blades. For him, the war had been terrible, yes, but also glorious. For Samuel, it had simply been real. The English and their allies had struck a crushing blow, but the war was not done with them yet. The graveyards of New England still yawned open, eager for more. Upon the disbanding of Winslow's army, the Indians began to gather once again around the frontier towns. On April 18, they attacked Marlborough for the second time and burned the homes they left standing the first time. They hovered on the outskirts of the town and set up numerous ambushes hoping to snare any messengers or relief columns that came their way. At dawn on April 21, 1675, the town of Sudbury's tenuous peace was shattered as native raiders descended upon it, besieging the local garrison and setting homes ablaze. Upon receiving word of the attack, Major Daniel Gookin swiftly dispatched a detachment of cavalry, a ply of horse, from Captain Prentice's troop. By evening, David and his fellow troopers arrived just in time to rescue the surviving members of Captain Samuel Wadsworth's company, who had taken refuge at the Sudbury Mill, valiantly holding off a vastly superior force. In a striking twist of fate, that very mill, known as the Sudbury Falls Mill, was owned by David's father, Elder John Stone, and would remain in the Stone family for more than 2 centuries. In the days leading up to the assault, the English had little idea of the large force of native warriors gathering around Marlborough and Sudbury. It was not until the early hours of April 21 that their presence became unmistakable. At dawn, several deserted houses were deliberately set ablaze, an apparent tactic to lure the garrisons from their fortified positions into a deadly ambush. Shortly thereafter, Deacon Haynes's garrison house came under intense attack by an even greater number of warriors. Despite the ferocity of the assault, the defenders held their ground with determination. The siege lasted from 6 o'clock in the morning until 1 o'clock in the afternoon, when the attackers finally withdrew, having failed to breach the defenses. Tragically, 12 volunteers from Concord, who had come to aid the besieged garrison, were lured into the river meadow by the enemy. It was a fatal trap, all were slain, save one. Elsewhere, a second group of reinforcements, 18 mounted men under the command of Edward Cowell, approached from Brookfield by way of Marlborough, following a different route than that taken by Captain Wadsworth. They, too, encountered an outlying party of warriors and came under sudden, fierce attack. In the skirmish that followed, 4 of Cowell's men were killed, 1 was wounded, and 5 horses were disabled, leaving the group battered and diminished. While the engagement with Captain Cowell's party was still unfolding, Captain Samuel Wadsworth and his company arrived on the scene around noon. Spotting what appeared to be a small group of native warriors, they advanced with their customary impetuousness, only to fall into yet another well-laid ambush. Believing they were pursuing no more than 100 enemy fighters, Wadsworth's men soon realized, too late, that they had been drawn into a trap by a force numbering over 500. Surrounded and outnumbered, they fell back to a nearby hill, where they made a valiant last stand. For nearly 4 hours, the embattled company held their position, inflicting heavy casualties upon the attackers in a desperate effort to survive. Captain Wadsworth's fierce engagement likely diverted the warriors' attention from both Cowell's party and Deacon Haynes's garrison, inadvertently saving many lives. Around the same time, the Watertown Company arrived and, undeterred by the danger, crossed the river in pursuit of the retreating enemy. With determination, they attempted to reach the hill where Wadsworth and his men were locked in a desperate struggle. But the odds were overwhelming. The sheer number of warriors opposed to them made further advance impossible. After a brave but futile effort, the Watertown men were compelled to retreat to the safety of Goodeno's garrison. But not long after nightfall, the enemy set the surrounding woods ablaze, casting an eerie glow over the battlefield and forcing the surviving English into a chaotic and disastrous retreat. Any semblance of order quickly dissolved. In the ensuing confusion and slaughter, both Captain Samuel Wadsworth and Captain Samuel Brocklebank were killed, along with the majority of their men. Out of the entire company, only 13 managed to escape, retreating to Noyes's Mill, where they made a final stand and successfully held the enemy at bay. Meanwhile, Captain Cowell, having withdrawn his battered party from their earlier engagement, returned to bury his fallen comrades. After completing this solemn duty, he took a different route back into town and arrived just in time to assist in rescuing Captain Prentice's troopers and reinforce the embattled men at the mill. The following day, the Watertown Company, joined by Captain Hunting's Christian Indian auxiliaries, returned to bury the dead. The site of the final stand, where Captain Samuel Wadsworth had so valiantly held the enemy at bay, lies on what is now known as Green Hill. In 1730, 54 years after the battle, a lasting tribute was erected there. Reverend Benjamin Wadsworth, the fifth son of Captain Wadsworth and then president of Harvard College, honored his father's sacrifice by commissioning a monument at the site, memorializing both his father and the men who perished alongside him. Regrettably, the exact number of Englishmen engaged in the battle has been lost to history. However, it is generally believed that Captain Wadsworth commanded approximately 70 men during the final stand on Green Hill, with Captain Brocklebank's company likely numbering a similar force. When at last the war came to its bitter end, there was little left of the great tribes that had once roamed New England's forests. The land was scarred, the rivers ran quieter, and the drums of resistance had fallen silent. Of the proud nations that had stood against the colonists, only remnants remained, fragments of families, scattered and starving, their villages turned to ashes. Chief Canonchet, fierce and unyielding to the end, was hunted like an animal through the woods he once called home. In April of 1676, he was captured and executed without ceremony. His death was swift, but its meaning lingered, another blow to a people whose world had already begun to vanish. Then, on August 12, 1676, the final stroke fell. It happened deep in the marshes near Mount Hope, the sacred heart of Wampanoag country. There, in a place the colonists would come to call the Misery Swamp, Captain Benjamin Church's men closed in on the one they called King Philip. He had been the soul of the rebellion, the last ember of resistance. And now, cornered, betrayed, and exhausted, Metacom fell beneath the guns of men who had once feared to speak his name. They did not spare him in death. His body was hanged, drawn, and quartered, his limbs sent across the colonies as trophies. His severed head was fixed upon a stake and mounted in the center of Plymouth, where it stood for years, blackened by sun and rain, a grim warning to all who passed. The land where he died, once called Mount Hope, would one day become Bristol, Rhode Island. The Wampanoag village that once thrived there had long since been erased. Only memories remained, quiet ones, buried beneath soil and stone. In 1906, more than 2 centuries after the blood had dried, the Rhode Island Society of Colonial Wars placed a monument near the site of Philip's final stand. It rests now in the wooded stillness of South Kingston, marking the place where 2 worlds collided, and one was lost forever. But the native tribes may have been decimated from the war, but 30% of the English population of New England were now scattered in long-forgotten graves. As for David, he returned home after the war and resumed the life he had set aside. On October 17, 1683, he purchased an additional 200 acres from Samuel Howe and Captain Samuel Gookin, the son of Major General Daniel Gookin of Cambridge. This particular parcel was part of a larger tract secured from the Indians the year before. It adjoined land David already owned and would, in the 19th century, become known as the Bennett and Leland Farm, marking his quiet yet enduring legacy on the land he defended. Elder John Stone had been spared the horrors of the Sudbury fight, having relocated to Cambridge 4 years earlier. Upon his death in 1682, his estate passed to his youngest daughter, Sarah Stone Hill, and her husband, Jacob Hill. They subsequently purchased the shares of the other heirs, thereby taking full possession of the property. Jacob Hill died in 1689, and in time, their son, Jacob Hill Jr., consolidated ownership by buying out his mother and siblings, John, Nathaniel, and Tabitha, on April 23, 1711. Elder John Stone had remained a respected figure in Cambridge until the end of his life. In 1682, just months before his death, he was elected one of the 2 ruling elders of the Cambridge Church, a position reflecting the high regard in which he was held by his fellow townsmen. He passed away on November 15, 1682, and was in Cambridge Cemetery under a stone that bore no titles, only a name. He left behind acres that would become towns, sons who would become founders, and a legacy measured not in applause, but in the echo of millstones, the strength of oak beams, and the quiet, enduring rhythm of a life built to last. But what became of the 3 Stone brothers, who were the sons of Simon and Mary Whipple Stone? Alas, the hills of Groton, Massachusetts, were quiet in the spring of 1676, but the stillness was a lie. Beneath the budding trees and alongside the newly thawed streams, the war stirred like a fever in the blood of the land. It was there, in a stout garrison house overlooking a sparse field, that Simon Stone stood watch, his musket cradled in calloused hands. He had seen enough of death to know it came swift and without grace. Simon was serving under Captain Joseph Sill, a seasoned man with a rifle as sure as any in the colonies. It was said that on April 17, 3 Indian warriors had ventured too close, drawn by the scent of swine. They may have thought the house abandoned, but Simon saw them, lean shadows against the edge of the woods. With a single crack from Sill's rifle, 2 fell. The third, a heartbeat behind, was dropped by another soldier's bullet. There was no time for sentiment. The war allowed none. By April 27, 6 companies were raised to sweep the wilds, one of which was Captain Prentice and another Captain Sill. As Simon marched, he must have known that his 2 cousins were nearby in their mounted troop. Rumor held that warriors had been spotted in the area of Hassanamacet. There, Natick scouts whispered of a gathering war party. The troops struck fast and hard. 16 warriors were captured or killed in the undergrowth. Still, the war did not rest. On May 10, disease thinned their ranks more cruelly than muskets. A coughing plague, some called it, swept through the men. They were sent home to recover. But on May 30, the call came again, summoning them to Brookfield. There, at Weshacom Ponds, they clashed with a band of warriors fishing at dawn. 7 were slain, 29 taken prisoner, with most of the latter women and children whose eyes held the terrible silence of the defeated. For Simon, the war bled into the seasons. In February of the new year, they captured 300 Indians in a single sweep. Later, he was part of an escort for a long train of 60 wagons, hauling supplies from Groton to Boston, 50 men against a wilderness that seemed determined to swallow them whole. And yet, when the smoke cleared and the final dead were buried, Simon Stone did not return to Groton. He made his way to Lyme, Connecticut, a quiet town that would one day bear the name Silltown. There he lived out his days, dying in 1696, buried in earth that had known peace and war alike. But what of his sons? There were 3 boys, Nathaniel, John, and Samuel, boys who had watched their father go off to war and return a changed man. Nathaniel, the eldest, had his father's eyes and his mother's quiet strength. He took up land near Groton and married a local girl, raising children under the same garrison walls that had once echoed with gunfire. John, ever the wanderer, traveled farther. Records would place him near the Connecticut River, where he traded with native bands and sometimes vanished for months. A man of the borderlands, neither wholly farmer nor frontiersman, but something in between. Samuel, the youngest, followed in Simon's martial footsteps. He was barely a man when he enlisted in a local militia, still wearing his father's old powder horn, the wood etched with the names of battles long past. He saw conflict in the later Indian skirmishes of New England, surviving more by cunning than by strength. Simon's sons never grew rich. They left no great legacies carved in stone. But in the silent fields of Groton, in the shadows of the pines along the Connecticut, and in the worn grooves of old roads that once bore the weight of war, the Stone name endured, not in monuments, but in the soil itself. As the smoke of war faded into the folds of memory, Simon Stone returned to Groton not as a soldier, but as a survivor. For his service, he received £3.11, a humble sum for a man who had ridden the breadth of New England, who had seen death in the eyes of strangers and buried friends beneath snow-choked soil. He accepted the payment without complaint. What he had truly earned was peace, though it would prove fleeting. He accepted the payment without complaint. What he had truly earned was peace, though it would prove fleeting. The war had ended officially on April 12, 1678, but the land had not forgotten. Its rivers still carried blood, and its forests still whispered warnings in the wind. The Abenaki had once called this place home, and though they had been driven north, the memory of displacement burned within them like coals beneath ash. Simon knew this. And so did his sons. By the summer of 1694, Nathaniel and Samuel were men grown, both tempered by their father's lessons and by skirmishes of their own. John had long since vanished to the wilderness, perhaps by choice or perhaps by fate, no one could say for sure. The two brothers remained in Groton, known among the local militia as steady hands, veterans hardened by years of tension that never fully dissipated. When the attack came on July 27, it came like a storm at dawn. The Abenaki warriors struck in silence, slipping through shadows with the grace of ghosts. The alarm was raised too late. Homes burned. Children cried. The militia fought bravely, but 20 townspeople were slain before the sun crested the treetops. 13 were taken captive, swallowed by the wilderness. At the heart of the defense stood Nathaniel and Samuel, muskets in hand, firing from the shattered windows of their family homestead. They fought not for glory, but for memory, for the lives of their neighbors, for the weight of old promises. Samuel was wounded in the shoulder, Nathaniel bore him back, the two retreating through smoke and ash, as they had once advanced in battle. Afterward, when the fires were doused and the captives mourned, the brothers stood in silence at the edge of town, staring into the trees that had once protected their enemies. They did not speak. They had learned long ago that grief had no language. Time, however, does not stand still, not even for the brave. Simon, aged though he was, endured. In the twilight of his life, he married Sarah Farnsworth, a widow of quiet grace and resolute strength. Together, they became pillars of Groton, shaping it not with muskets, but with governance. Simon was named one of the original proprietors of the town, his name etched into the land he had helped defend. He served as town clerk, then later as a representative to the general court, an honor he bore with humility. He lived a long life, long enough to see his grandchildren run through the meadows he once patrolled with sword and powder. Long enough to walk the streets of a town that had grown from ashes, rebuilt again and again by hands like his. When he died in 1741, they buried him beside Sarah in the old burying ground. His stone still stands, worn by weather but resolute, like the man himself. And though the names of Nathaniel, Samuel, and even John have faded from common memory, their legacy lingers in Groton soil, in the stones of old houses, in the lineage of those who survived, and in the quiet courage passed down from father to son. Some stories do not end. They simply rest beneath the earth, waiting to be told again. The wind rolled off the Merrimack, sharp and clean in the early spring of 1676, carrying with it the sounds of the woods, the distant knock of a woodpecker, the creak of tall trees, the occasional splash of water against a birch-bark canoe. Somewhere out there, beyond the veil of green, eyes were watching. That was what John Stone had been trained to remember. He was just 17 when he rode out with his uncle, Colonel John Whipple, a stern man whose very presence could straighten a slouched spine. John had left Groton with a musket nearly too long for his young arms, but with fire in his chest. His orders were clear: scout the Connecticut River, track the movements of native warriors, and deliver warning when danger stirred. The colonists knew the rivers were lifelines, arteries for supplies, for war, for hope. So did the native tribes. Both sides patrolled them, both sides struck along their banks. John's first weeks along the Connecticut were marked by long silences and sudden violence. Smoke rising in the distance might mean a village razed, or merely a cooking fire. He learned to read the trees as others read scripture, to listen to the breath of the forest. Once, he stumbled upon a band of Abenaki before they saw him. He turned and ran 5 miles barefoot to warn a nearby settlement. For that, and more, he was paid £3, 8 shillings, and 6 pence, a soldier's sum, small enough to vanish in the shadow of what he gave. Later, he served under Captain Jonathan Poole, garrison duty this time. The work was slower, but not without tension. Nights were long and cold, and even behind stone walls, the whisper of an arrow or the crack of musket fire could come at any moment. He earned £1, 11 shillings for those months, a payment he kept folded in a Bible until the day he died. When the war finally gave way to fragile peace, John came home. Groton was not the same as when he left. Burned in raids, rebuilt in haste, the town had the look of a survivor, scarred, but standing. His brother Simon had already begun to make a name for himself in local affairs, and John joined him there, living at first in a house thick with the voices of kin. The Farnsworths, in-laws through Simon's wife Sarah, offered warmth and space and fellowship. The land John settled on was part of a claim made years earlier by their father, one of Groton's first proprietors. A quiet inheritance of responsibility and opportunity. But it was in Simon's house that John came to know Sarah Nutting Farnsworth, a woman of quiet wit and calm resolve. She had lost her husband, Matthias Farnsworth, just a year before. She was no stranger to grief or labor, and in John, she found a partner who understood the world as it truly was, neither fair nor cruel, but simply what it was. They married on March 17, 1692, in a ceremony that drew neighbors and kin alike. There was no grand feast, only strong cider and hymns sung low as the sun went down. Together, they built a life on a modest farm that bordered Simon's land. The forest grew back around them, as it always did, and the ghosts of war gave way to the rhythms of planting, harvesting, and raising children. John Stone never wrote memoirs, never sought office, never built more than what his hands could manage. But his name lived on, in town records, in the memories of neighbors, in the stillness of the fields he once patrolled as a boy with 2 big boots and a heart too full of fire. And in Groton, where the stones still held firm against the weather, that was enough. The drums were still beating when Matthew Stone stepped into the ranks at Roxbury, barely 15 and already a soldier. He was too young to shave, but no one questioned his courage. He was a stone, after all, and the blood of Groton ran thick in his veins. His brothers, Simon and John, had already carved names into the record of the war. Now it was Matthew's turn. He marched beneath the banner of Captain Daniel Henchman, a man both respected and reviled in equal measure. In Boston, the air was thick with hatred, not just for the enemy, but for those who dared show mercy. The Reverend John Eliot left, old and lion-hearted, and Captain Daniel Gookin, strong in both word and will, had spoken in defense of the so-called praying Indians, converted natives caught between two fires. Their stance earned scorn and suspicion from the colonists, who saw no difference between friend and foe if the skin was the same. Captain Henchman stood with them, more moderate than most. For this, he bore a weight heavier than any musket. Many of his own soldiers distrusted him, questioning his resolve when King Philip slipped through his fingers at Rehoboth. His command faltered beneath the pressure. When he assembled his men at the Roxbury meeting house to march, they balked. They refused to serve under him, demanding another officer. The council, caught between discipline and discontent, sent Captain Lake as a compromise. But the soldiers refused to credit the mission with any glory under Lake's command. It was an ugly, ignoble episode in a war already rich in grief. Matthew stayed silent through it all. He was too young, too fresh, and too wise to raise his voice when his elders lost theirs. But he saw it, how ideals splintered beneath the weight of fear, how leadership was as much about surviving hatred as it was winning battles. Henchman was reassigned to the outer towns, tasked with the thankless work of regulating garrisons and calming frightened settlements. It was there, among outposts like Chelmsford, that Matthew found his place, not in the headlines of history, but in the quieter footnotes, standing watch against the dark. When the war faded, Matthew did not. He turned from the sword to the plough, and then from the plough to politics. In time, he became a landowner in Lancaster and Leominster, and a man of standing in Sudbury, where he represented his town in the General Court. He married twice. First to Rachel Pond, in 1681, a marriage of warmth and shared resolve. They had little time. She passed in 1695. The following year, he married Mary Plimpton, a woman of steady character, and together they built a household that weathered the years with quiet dignity. Matthew lived long, until 1743, outliving not only the war of his youth, but many of those who had fought in it. His name appears now in old records, beside tracts of land and court documents, his presence steady, if uncelebrated. But among the townsfolk of Sudbury, his was a name spoken with respect. He had been a boy soldier, then a man of judgment and peace. He was, in the end, a bridge between generations, from the bloodshed of King Philip's war to the fragile order of a new century. And like his brothers Simon and John, he carried the Stone name not with pride, but with purpose. Together, the three brothers formed a living chronicle of a young America, hardened by war, softened by land and love, remembered not in marble, but in the homes and histories they helped to build.